Two women in Georgia were forced to stand for 3 hours, hands bound with duct tape, simply for smiling at the same neighbor. At the center of it all was Margaret Voss, the HOA president who treated her community like a kingdom and public shame like policy. But when a retired federal prosecutor stepped in and leaked emails exposed the truth, everything turned upside down. What started as quiet humiliation became a national reckoning. And the way justice was served will leave you stunned. It was just a smile, not the kind meant to provoke, not flirty, not rehearsed. Just two women, tired but decent, sharing a moment of lightness under the Georgia sun. Laura Bennett had just wrangled her golden retriever, Scout, away from knocking over the mailboxes again. Her leggings were dusty, her coffee had spilled, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours. Across from her stood Rachel Coleman, barefoot, clutching a rolled-up design magazine, wearing sunglasses not to shield from the sun, but to hide the remnants of last night's tears. Neither had planned to talk. But when Ethan Harper, the new guy, walked by with his giant sunglasses, Bluetooth earbuds, and a comically oversized smoker being wheeled into his yard, Laura chuckled. All that for some ribs? Rachel smirked. Must be feeding the whole block. Ethan laughed, guilty. That was Ida three-way chuckle. Then back to silence, back to the regular morning. No one cursed, no one loitered, no one trespassed. But Summerdale Estates wasn't just any suburb. It was governed by one of the strictest HOAs in the state. Rules weren't guidelines. They were law, carved into stone by people with nothing better to do than protect the character of the community. So when certified envelopes landed on their doorsteps the next morning, both women assumed it was a mistake. Laura opened hers first. Rachel's came later that afternoon. Notice of violation, Section 4.2. Engagement in unsanctioned excessive social interaction with fellow residents without prior notification to HOA board. Incident recorded on April 3rd, 8:14 a.m. Near Community Mail Drop 3. Corrective action required. Response due in 48 hours. Laura reread it 3 times, then laughed not because it was funny, but because it felt too absurd to be real. Rachel texted within minutes. Did you get this letter too? WTF is Section 4.2. Neither knew what was coming. They didn't know a smile would be classified as a disruption, that the HOA had cameras pointed at the mailbox, or that someone had filed a report within minutes. They certainly didn't know their friendly conduct would be interpreted as a breach of community decorum initiated without clearance. In any other neighborhood, this would have been laughable. But in Summerdale Estates, HOA bylaws were gospel, and their enforcers were zealots in cardigans. What started as a smile was now labeled an incident, and the punishment was just beginning. Laura thought it was a prank. She laughed when she saw the letter tucked between an Amazon package and a vet bill, printed on glossy HOA letterhead. It looked too ridiculous to be real. Rachel laughed too. What is this, the Scarlet Letter HOA edition? They planned to show up at the next board meeting and call it out, maybe bring donuts, maybe a lawyer, maybe just walk out. But they went, and that's when everything changed. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, mahogany chairs, stale lemonade, printed agendas on cream paper. Half the audience was retirees with notepads, the other half watched in silence. At exactly 6 p.m., Margaret Voss entered like a judge in a courtroom. She built herself white blouse, string of pearls, matching clipboard, no smile. We are here to address the violation of Article 4.2, she began, and to discuss necessary corrective measures for the benefit of the community. Laura raised her hand. With all due respect, this is over a smile and a joke to a neighbor. Margaret didn't flinch. To preserve the harmony of this community, she said, voice clear and rehearsed, violators will serve corrective standing time. 3 hours, hands bound, public property, signage required. Someone coughed. A paper rustled. No one spoke up. Rachel's voice broke the silence. You want us to what? Margaret calmly elaborated. They were to appear on the main HOA lawn that Saturday, 9 a.m. Their wrists would be secured in a symbolic fashion, non-lethal but visible. They would each wear signage clearly stating their offense. Failure to appear would result in a $5,000 community disruption fine and formal eviction proceedings. Laura looked around the room. No one made eye contact. It was surreal, absurd, but real. Saturday came, 92 degrees by 9 a.m. The HOA lawn had been mowed the night before, fresh stripes, not a leaf out of place. 2 folding chairs sat nearby, not for Laura and Rachel, but for bored observers. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early with a clipboard and 3 witnesses. The women stood side by side, duct tape around their wrists tight enough to be uncomfortable, loose enough to avoid a lawsuit. Around their necks hung cardboard signs, hand-painted in HOA-approved font. I disrupted community order. Neighbors walked by, some paused, some whispered, a few filmed. A child on a scooter laughed. A teenage boy, someone's son, rode up and tossed a half-melted slushie onto the grass near Laura's shoes. It splashed her ankle. He didn't look back. No one intervened. For 3 hours, they stood the rebound, silent, sweating, shamed. The heat bore down. The duct tape stuck and pulled at their skin. Margaret took notes. One board member offered a lukewarm bottle of water, but only once the timer ended. To the HOA, this wasn't punishment, it was policy. Correction, not cruelty. Order, not oppression. But to Laura and Rachel, it was a public ritual, a display of power, a warning. This is what happens when you smile without permission. It started with one upload a blurry vertical video, filmed by a teen from across the street. You could hear someone laughing off camera. You could see Laura and Rachel, wrists duct-taped, faces unreadable behind the sun's glare. The caption, "My HOA just did this to 2 moms for talking to the same dude." By nightfall, it was on Reddit. By morning, it had crossed to TikTok stitched with commentary, reaction videos, parodies. Then came X threads, YouTube breakdowns, think pieces, memes, duets, podcast debates, Instagram carousels with titles like "When Suburbia Turns to Surveillance, The Dark Side of HOAs." Within 48 hours, hashtags were everywhere. HOA ending, smile and punished, duct tape justice. Comments flooded in. Are we in North Korea or Georgia? This feels like Handmaid's Tale cul-de-sac edition. HOAs are just legalized cults for control freaks. Plot twist, they smiled at the HOA president's ex. Someone called John Oliver. This is his next episode. The story took off because it was absurd to ignore. People love scandal, but they devour absurdity that's real. The internet raged, joked, rallied. But in Summerdale, the vibe was colder, quieter. At Laura's bakery job, her manager called her into the office. "You've been great," he said, not meeting her eyes. But customers are asking questions. The owner's uncomfortable with everything. She was let go, no misconduct, just too much attention. Rachel's daughter, Sophie, came home from school early after locking herself in a bathroom stall. Girls had followed her, whispering, "Is your mom that HOA freak? You guys into, like, bondage or something?" No one at school did anything. At the grocery store, Rachel overheard. "That's the one from the video." The humiliation, meant to last 3 hours, followed them everywhere. Even at home, their inboxes were a minefield, half sympathy, half hate. Some called them heroes, some called them attention seekers. Others said they were lucky it wasn't worse. Laura unplugged her doorbell cam after someone rang it at 2 a.m. and left a duct tape roll on her porch. Then, right when it felt like they might drown in the noise, came the ping. Laura opened her laptop and saw the email. Subject, legal inquiry, possible civil rights violation. From Elena Torres, sent 3:02 a.m. She clicked and read, and for the first time in days, her hands trembled for a different reason. Elena wasn't just any lawyer. She was a former federal prosecutor. "I saw the footage. I've reviewed the HOA bylaws," she wrote. "If you're ready, I'd like to talk about how we end this for good." And just like that, the tide began to turn, not online, but in real life. Elena Torres was done with courtrooms, deadlines, and trying to fix a system that barely wanted fixing. After 22 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, prosecuting civil rights violations and racketeering cases from New Jersey to Mississippi, she retired quietly to Asheville, North Carolina. Her law degree was framed but dusty. Her inbox was blissfully quiet. She had traded closing statements for gardening. She hadn't worn a suit in over a year. Then came her daughter, 17, sharp-tongued, politically allergic to apathy. She stormed into the kitchen one night, phone in hand, screen lit up with the viral HOA video. "You always said America protects freedom. This doesn't look like freedom, Mom." Elena rolled her eyes at first. Another viral mess, Another social media outrage cycle. But she watched. The duct-taped wrists, the sunburned skin, the signs around their necks, the HOA lawn, the neighbor's silence. She didn't speak when the video ended. She opened her laptop, searched, cross-referenced, and by sunrise was making calls, pulling records, reviewing bylaws, digging into HOA codes and Georgia civil statutes like old muscle memory. By 72 hours later, Elena was in Summerdale, Georgia, wearing a navy blue pantsuit she hadn't touched in 14 months, sitting in a small cafe across from two women who looked exhausted, suspicious, and more than a little broken. Rachel fidgeted with her napkin. Laura had her arms crossed like a shield. Elena didn't waste time. She opened her notepad, looked them in the eyes. What was done to you wasn't just wrong. It was unconstitutional. They violated your rights under color of law. They used public shame as punishment without due process. That's not just a bad rule. That's federally challengeable. Laura leaned forward. Are you saying this is illegal? Elena nodded, calm. I'm saying you've just become the face of a federal civil rights lawsuit. Silence. A breath held between what had been and what could be. If you're ready, she said, closing her notepad. We fight. For the first time in weeks, Rachel didn't feel like a punchline. Laura didn't feel like a criminal. They felt like plaintiffs. And Elena? She felt like a lawyer again. Elena wasn't building a media case. She was building a federal one. To beat an HOA and court an entity that operated like a private government wrapped in legal insulation, she needed more than outrage. She needed paper. The lawsuit was filed under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, a rarely used but powerful statute that allowed citizens to sue when their civil rights were violated under color of law. It was the same law used to hold rogue police departments accountable, the same law that took down abusive school boards. Now it was pointed at the gates of a suburban HOA. That alone made waves. But what came next blew the case wide open. The email arrived anonymously, no name, no intro, just an attachment and 5 words. She said more than that. Elena scanned the sender's address, masked, secure. Likely a former board member, she guessed, someone close to the inner circle. She clicked open the documents. Dozens of internal HOA emails, exported and zipped. Some were mundane lawn maintenance updates, sprinkler schedules, noise complaints. Then came a thread labeled Disruption Protocol, Mailbox Incident, dated hours after Laura and Rachel's interaction with Ethan Harper. In a message from Margaret Voss to the full HOA board. If they're allowed to freely socialize, what's next? Yard sales? Bible studies? Petitions? This is how disorder starts. We maintain structure through visibility. Humiliation works. Make them examples. Another email followed, responding to a board member's concern about legal liability. Our bylaws give us wide discretion. Public corrective action sends the clearest message. Soft consequences breed disobedience. There it was, in writing. This wasn't about protecting peace or enforcing harmless rules. It was targeted control, a philosophy, a worldview. Elena printed the thread, highlighted each line, and slid it into the growing binder titled Bennett and Coleman v. Summerdale Estates HOA. She paused over one phrase. Soft consequences breed disobedience. It read like dystopian fiction, but it was real, suburban America. That night, she called Laura and Rachel. They never cared about the rule, she told them. They cared about the warning. You were never the problem. You were the example. Laura didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was steady. Then let's be the example that stops them. That's when Elena knew this wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. Summerdale Estates was no longer just a gated community in Georgia. It had become a headline. By the time the story hit CNN's evening broadcast, it had circled through morning shows, op-eds, and news apps. The 6-minute segment on the women bound for smiling pierced the noise. The footage aired again, duct tape, heat waves rising from the sidewalk, signs around their necks. Voiceovers explained how the corrective action had been authorized, echoing public shaming tactics. One anchor closed with a line that went viral. Some neighborhoods build fences to keep danger out. Others use them to keep control in. The ACLU issued a statement that evening, calling it an unconstitutional act of extrajudicial punishment, and warning that private governance structures like HOAs were increasingly behaving like unregulated municipalities with no oversight. Within 24 hours, petitions popped up: abolish abusive HOAs, pass the Neighborhood Rights Act, justice for Laura and Rachel. Tens of thousands of signatures. Law professors wrote open letters. Civil rights groups posted solidarity messages. Even John Oliver's team requested background materials. But not everyone welcomed the attention. Local officials, who once praised the discipline of the Summerdale HOA, changed their tune, releasing lukewarm statements about updated community practices. One councilman tweeted, "We stand with residents." None mentioned Margaret Voss by name, but they didn't have to. Her silence was deafening. Still, she refused to step down. She told a local paper, it was a correction, not a punishment. If people are uncomfortable with structure, perhaps they shouldn't live in structured communities. The quote backfired hard. While the board scrambled to do damage control, Laura and Rachel did something unexpected. They showed up not in court, but in person at a town hall meeting. They spoke side by side for the first time since the lawn. Rachel stepped to the mic, her voice steady. This isn't about duct tape. It's about how many people are quietly suffering behind HOA walls, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen, even afraid to smile. The room went quiet. Then came applause, questions, invitations to speak at university panels, civil rights forums, city council hearings. They weren't victims anymore, they were witnesses, advocates, reluctantly but powerfully leaders of something larger than their neighborhood. Elena Torres watched from a hotel room in Atlanta, binder open, coffee in hand. She wasn't surprised. You give the truth a microphone, she muttered, smiling, and it learns how to sing. The tide was turning, and Margaret Voss, once untouchable, was standing ankle-deep, pretending the water wasn't rising. 9 months later, the federal courthouse doors opened to a packed room. No signs, no shouting crowds, just a silent line of reporters, legal interns, and citizens who had followed the case from hashtag to headline to courtroom. Inside, the air was thick. Cameras weren't allowed, but phones buzzed with live tweets. The presiding judge, Honorable Judith Langston, a seasoned federal justice with little patience for theatrics, had read the briefs and reviewed the exhibits. When the video played Laura and Rachel, bound by duct tape, sweating under the Georgia sun, she looked down and slowly removed her glasses. No sound in the courtroom, no coughs, no typing, just the faint hum of the projector as the video played, unedited, raw. Then came the emails. One by one, Elena read them into the record. Humiliation works. Make them examples. If they're allowed to freely socialize, what's next? Yard sales? Community disarray? Soft consequences breed disobedience. The judge stopped her. I've heard enough. Continue with your summation. When Margaret Voss took the stand, she walked with the same posture she carried into HOA boardrooms, confident, composed, pressed blouse, pearl earrings. But the courtroom was not Summerdale, and she didn't hold the gavel. Her lawyer asked the expected questions. Margaret kept her answers clipped, controlled. I was maintaining order. I did what needed to be done. The community depends on leadership. Elena stood, cross-examined slowly. No tricks, no raised voice, just one question. Do you believe public shaming is an acceptable form of governance? Margaret hesitated, just for a second. It depends on the context. That silence afterward was louder than anything spoken. The verdict came the next morning. In the matter of Bennett and Coleman v. Summerdale Estates HOA, this court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. The actions taken by the HOA board, specifically those authorized by President Margaret Voss, constitute a violation of civil liberties under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. The court awarded damages of $1.2 million. Gasps, then silence. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this ruling mandates immediate reform of the HOA's bylaws to align with federal due process protections. And finally, this court orders that Margaret Voss be permanently barred from serving in any HOA or public leadership position within the United States. No applause, just quiet tears from Rachel. Laura squeezed her hand. Outside, reporters rushed for comments. Elena declined. Rachel didn't. This wasn't just for us, she said, voice calm. This was for every person silenced by a rulebook designed to control, not protect. That afternoon, the Department of Housing and Urban Development announced a federal investigation into HOA misconduct practices nationwide. Summerdale had gone from a punchline to a precedent. Justice didn't come with fanfare. It came in the gavel's echo. And for once, the sound of law meant freedom. Laura and Rachel didn't walk away with just a check or a verdict. They walked away with conviction. They could have disappeared, taken the settlement, moved to a new zip code, started over. No one would have blamed them. Instead, they built something. The HOA Survivors Alliance launched 3 months later with a laptop, a $500 website, and a tagline in bold black letters. Just because it's private doesn't mean it's lawful. The mission: provide legal aid, emotional support, and advocacy for people facing HOA harassment, abuse, and overreach. They didn't want to burn HOAs to the ground. They wanted to draw lines. You don't get to fine someone for planting sunflowers. You don't get to shame someone for hanging a pride flag. You don't get to bind a woman's hands because she smiled at a neighbor. Within weeks, their inbox overflowed. Stories poured in. A man in Nevada evicted for refusing to repaint his garage desert beige. A veteran in Texas fined $200 a day for flying an American flag on a too-tall pole. A family in Arizona forced to remove a wheelchair ramp for elevation aesthetics. Some stories were frustrating, some absurd, some worse than what Laura and Rachel endured. One woman in Florida wrote, "I haven't parked in front of my own house in 5 years. Every time I do, they send someone to knock on my door." Another man in Ohio, "Our HOA president installed cameras pointing at our windows. We feel watched because we are." Laura handled intake emails. Rachel organized weekly Zoom support calls where strangers cried, laughed, vented. Elena joined as legal advisor, drafting model legislation for HOA accountability. The movement was no longer about one lawn, it was about liberty in the spaces people called home. The documentary came next. A producer from an indie film studio approached after hearing their story on a legal podcast. Order and Obedience: Life Behind the Gate premiered at South by Southwest, winning an audience award. It ended with Laura and Rachel on the same HOA lawn, holding a banner, "No more shame, no more silence." And they kept going. By the end of the first year, the HOA Survivors Alliance had helped 93 families retain pro bono legal support, overturned 7 HOA policies, and provided mental health referrals to over 300 individuals. They spoke on panels, podcasts, Capitol Hill, but most importantly, they were heard. What started with duct tape turned into a movement. What was once isolated shame became a shared voice. Laura and Rachel never expected to become activists. They just refused to stay silent. They gave language to what millions of Americans felt but never dared say. Home should feel safe, not ruled. Laura didn't want headlines. She wanted healing. A few months after the ruling, she enrolled in community college to finish the degree she'd abandoned after her son was born, majoring in social work. She was done with HOA rules, but not with helping people. She still walked Scout around the block. Now neighbors waved nervously, sheepishly, always respectfully. Rachel took a different path, she wrote. Her memoir, Bound But Not Broken, published by a small press, exploded online. Raw, unfiltered, filled with journal entries, court transcripts, and quiet moments from the days that nearly broke her. It included a chapter titled "The Silence Between Us on the Lawn." It hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2 weeks. Oprah called it a reckoning in paperback. Book clubs used it to discuss shame, control, and the fine print in HOA agreements. HOA horror stories were no longer whispered on X threads or traded in parking lots between neighbors too afraid to speak. They were broadcast, investigated, stopped. Journalists ran exposés on rogue HOA boards. State lawmakers pushed bills to limit HOA power and require oversight. People stopped asking, "What did the homeowner do wrong?" and started asking, "Who gave these boards the right?" Elena Torres returned to North Carolina with a case binder she refused to file away. She began consulting on civil rights education for legal clinics. When nominated for the Civil Liberties Defender Award, her 43-second speech ended. Justice isn't loud, it's consistent. And sometimes, it starts with 2 women who smiled at the wrong time. In Summerdale, the gates still stood, the lawns still trimmed. But something in the air had changed. The community that once sneered, filmed, and judged now held barbecues on that same grass. Children played tag, neighbors chatted without fear. Once a year, On the lawsuit's anniversary, the HOA lawn hosts a community picnic. No permits, no dress codes, no silence. No one talks about Margaret Voss anymore, but they remember the sign, "I disrupted community order." Now it's a joke, a badge, a t-shirt. The law is not a gated privilege. And a smile? A smile is not a crime. It's where humanity begins. And in Summerdale, finally, it's where freedom lives.